In a quiet, remote village, there lived a peculiar couple named John and Mary. They were an elderly husband and wife, both nearly as deaf as each other, which made for some amusing and frustrating misunderstandings. Despite their challenges, they had established a simple life and routine. One of their quirks was a very specific meal rotation they followed with almost religious devotion. It was their own little system, and they stuck to it strictly. Every other day, Mary would cook cabbage with tamarind and soup without tamarind. On the alternate days, she would prepare cabbage without tamarind and soup with tamarind. This cycle repeated like clockwork, and the two of them rarely deviated from it. One evening, John sat down at their small table, ready for his meal. The aroma of tamarind-infused cabbage filled the room, and as he took a bite, he found it particularly delicious. There was something especially savory and delightful about the tamarind cabbage that day, and John was so pleased with the taste that he decided he wanted it again the next day. But the problem was, as he tried to convey this request to Mary, she, being as deaf as he was, couldn't understand his instructions at all. John attempted to explain, using exaggerated gestures and expressions, hoping to get his message across. He pointed at the cabbage, made a show of chewing and smiling to indicate his approval, and then gestured to suggest he wanted the same dish again tomorrow. But Mary, baffled and confused, merely nodded, pretending to understand, while in reality, she had no idea what he was trying to tell her. Following their long-standing routine, she woke up the next morning and prepared cabbage without tamarind, just as the meal schedule dictated. When John sat down for his lunch the next day, eagerly expecting the same delicious tamarind cabbage, he was met with disappointment. He looked down at his plate and immediately realized his instructions had been completely ignored. The cabbage sat there, plain and without a hint of tamarind flavor, just as it usually was on this day of the cycle. Frustration and anger bubbled up inside him. After all, he had made a simple request, or so he thought. And yet here he was, facing the same bland cabbage, despite his clear wish for the tasty tamarind version. Unable to contain his irritation, John scowled, grabbed his bowl of cabbage, and, in a fit of rage, hurled it across the room. The bowl crashed against the wall, spilling cabbage everywhere, and John stomped out of the house without a word, leaving Mary to clean up the mess. She stood there for a moment, stunned, then slowly began to eat her own meal, unfazed. After finishing her lunch, she decided to prepare tamarind-flavored cabbage for him anyway, thinking he would appreciate it when he returned and calmed down. Meanwhile, John stormed out of the village, fuming, his face still flushed with anger. He walked aimlessly until he found himself at a crossroad where three paths intersected. Taking a seat on a large flat stone, he sat there sulking, trying to calm himself down. But his peace didn't last long. Just then, a shepherd named Thomas came along, guiding his flock through the dusty road. Thomas, too, had his own troubles. He had lost a prized cow and its calf several days prior and had been searching for them tirelessly. When he saw John sitting alone at the crossroads, Thomas thought he might be a soothsayer, someone gifted in the art of Josium, the ancient art of predicting things. Perhaps, Thomas thought, this soothsayer could reveal the location of his missing cow and calf. But there was a catch. Thomas was as deaf as John, and so their encounter was destined to be a comedy of errors, filled with hope. Thomas approached John and, using hand gestures and broken words, tried to ask where his missing cow might be. John, of course, couldn't hear him at all. He looked up, irritated at being disturbed in his quiet moment of sulking. He wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Mistaking Thomas's gestures for accusations or complaints, John grew annoyed. Without saying a word, he started waving his hands wildly, motioning for Thomas to go away. He pointed angrily, gesturing towards the road in an attempt to dismiss the shepherd. But Thomas, interpreting these gestures in his own way, assumed that John was guiding him towards his lost animals. Grateful for what he perceived as divine direction, Thomas thanked him profusely with a deep bow and set off down the path John had pointed to, convinced he would find his cow and calf. To Thomas's astonishment, as he followed the path, he soon found his beloved animals grazing by the roadside, right where John had unknowingly directed him. Overwhelmed with joy, he hugged the cow's neck and stroked the calf, whispering his thanks to John's guidance. In his happiness, Thomas decided he would honor his promise by offering the calf to John as a gift. Grateful and excited, he led the cow and calf back down the path towards the crossroads, eager to repay the soothsayer's wisdom. When he reached John, he pointed to the calf, indicating it was a gift for him. But the calf, unfortunately, had a broken and crooked tail. John, seeing Thomas gesturing and pointing to the crooked tail, thought the shepherd was accusing him of breaking it. Feeling unfairly blamed, John began to protest with furious hand waves, shaking his head vigorously. To him, it seemed Thomas was trying to pin the blame for the calf's broken tail on him, and he refused to accept responsibility. Thomas, though, was just as confused as ever. He saw John's exaggerated gestures and assumed that John was refusing the calf and demanding the cow instead. Thomas, taken aback by what he saw as John's greed, shouted, "You're too greedy! I offered you the calf, but the cow is mine. I never promised you both." John, growing even more frustrated, retorted, "How dare you accuse me of breaking the tail? I've never even seen this calf before today." They argued back and forth, each man certain he was in the right, their voices growing louder and more agitated as the misunderstandings piled up. As the quarrel escalated, a third traveler happened to pass by. His name was Peter, and he was a sly and cunning man who quickly assessed the situation. Observing that neither John nor Thomas could hear the other, Peter saw an opportunity to take advantage of their deafness. Intervening smoothly, he spoke in a loud voice directed at Thomas. "Shepherd, you'd best leave the cow and calf here with me. I'll make sure the soothsayer accepts his reward. These soothsayers can be stubborn, but don't worry, I'll handle it." Relieved, Thomas gladly left the calf with Peter, trusting he had fulfilled his promise. He guided his cow back home, glad to be rid of the troublesome situation. Peter, meanwhile, took hold of the calf, planning to make off with it as soon as he had settled things with John. Turning to John, Peter pretended to sympathize, saying, "That shepherd was out of line to accuse you. Shepherds are fools, always blaming others for their own misdeeds. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." John, feeling reassured, thanked Peter and left the crossroads, hurrying back to his home, eager to avoid further accusations and misunderstanding. Peter, now in possession of the calf, chuckled to himself, delighted by his cleverness in fooling both John and Thomas. He took the calf and went on his way, pleased with his unexpected gain. When John returned home, still grumbling, he sat down for his meal. Mary, having cooked the tamarind-flavored cabbage he had wanted the day before, served it to him with a smile. As John took a bite, he found the taste of tamarind he had so desired. Satisfied, he pointed at the plate where he remembered the plain cabbage had been before, and asked for more. Mary chuckled, explaining that the pot was empty. but offered to scrape the last bits from the pan if he wanted them. And so John finally enjoyed his tamarind cabbage in peace, oblivious to the confusion he'd caused and the calf that had slipped out of his life, while Peter walked away with his ill-gotten prize, laughing all the way home.